reefs and why they're so important that we protect them. Okay, so firstly, just exactly what do we think a coral is? So do we think it's an animal, a plant, or a rock? So any ideas? I hear animal.
Animal.
Yeah, very good. So coral's an animal. It's related to the jellyfish and the sea anemones, so they're all in a big group together. And the reason they're in this group is they all have stinging tentacles, so that puts them together in the same group. And an individual coral animal is called a polyp. Okay, so here on the screen, if you can see in the background here, we have the photograph of the surface of a coral, and we can see the individual polyps. So they live together in a colony of polyps. And even though the polyps look kind of like plants, they're actually animals. But there is something to do with plants. It's not immediately obvious, but inside the polyps, there are tiny algae that live. And these are a symbiotic algae, so it's a kind of microalgae. And like all plants, they make energy from the sun. And the energy that the algae make, they pass on to the coral animal. And the coral animal uses the energy to make its skeleton, so it makes rock. So it makes the limestone reef. And here we can see there's two main groups of corals, and the most important one are the hard corals, and they're the ones that build the coral reef structure. So here we can see a colony of sun coral. Okay, and I'm not sure if you can see this, but here we can see the individual polyp, and inside we can see the green color. This is the tiny algae. So there's so many of them in the polyps that they give the coral a green or brown color. Okay, so here's a polyp. On the skeleton itself, each one of these little polyps lives in a little house called a corallite that it makes from limestone rock. And here we can see a nice colony of sun coral. And this photograph was taken from our house reef. The other big group of corals are the soft corals, and they're very closely related to the hard corals. But these ones, they don't make a skeleton, so they don't contribute to the reef building, but they live on the coral reef. And for these ones, the polyps always have 8 tentacles, so we can distinguish them by counting the number of tentacles. And some of them have algae inside as well that provide energy, so they're solar powered like the hard corals, and that's used for growth, but they don't actually make a stony skeleton, but they're important members of the reef. And here we can see the six main types of coral growth form, and this kind is a massive type coral, kind of a boulder shape. And here we can find some examples of these massive corals just a bit further out here that are 5 meters in diameter, and they grow very slowly. So they grow about 1 centimeter every year, and a 5 meter diameter coral is therefore 500 years old, so they live a very long time. And these are important, making the foundation of the reef. They make the reef very strong. And then another very important group of corals are the branching corals. And these ones, they grow a lot faster. So they can grow up to 20 centimeters in a year. And they're important for providing a lot of the structure and habitat on the reef for all the other animals to live. So they're very important for that reason. And these are all colonies of polyps that live together. But some corals just consist of a single polyp. So this is a mushroom coral, and it makes a skeleton, but it's just one giant polyp. So I'd like to introduce a very important group of corals, and these are the staghorn corals or acropora corals. And there are 120 species in the whole world. And here in Indonesia we have 110 species, so most of them are found here. And we can distinguish the group. They have a special corallite at the tip of the branch, which you maybe can't see very well, but this is where the branch extends and grows upwards. And then we have radial corallites along the branch, so you can distinguish them quite easily as a group. And these ones, they make shapes from branches, so they make different shapes, bushy colonies, and also they make tables as well. So these ones very important, providing many places for the fish to live and all the other invertebrates on the reef. And this one, so if we look at the polyps here, we can see they've got 8 tentacles, and that classifies them as a soft coral in the group of soft corals. But this one is an exception to the rule that they don't make a hard skeleton. This one does. There are 2 species that make a hard skeleton as well. And this one is very important because it's organ pipe coral that makes a bright red skeleton, and this is the coral that makes pink beach pink. So the skeleton is a bright red in color, okay, and that breaks down to make the sand, and the white sand from the normal coral mixes with this one, the red sand, and it gives us our wonderful pink beaches. And there's not many pink beaches in the world. There's about 7 or 8 in the whole world, and we can find 3 in the national park. So just a little bit about coral reefs in Indonesia in general. So we've got 15% of the world's coral reefs, so very important, and a high number of diversity of species. 570 species of hard corals in the whole of Indonesia, 66% of the world's total. And Komodo National Park, we have 250 different species of the hard coral, so very important. We've still got many fine examples of reefs in Indonesia, very healthy, but unfortunately we've also got places where the reefs have been affected by human activities. They are degraded or damaged. So this is a problem all over the world. We're losing our coral reefs, and we've lost 50% of our coral reefs since 1970. And if we look at the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, as another example, it's lost half of its coral cover. 50% of the coral is dead since the mid-90s. And what's happening is we've got the reef, it's alive here, bustling with life, like an underwater city with all these things living there. And then we get a stress of some kind which causes coral bleaching, where the coral turns white. And then if the stress continues, the coral dies. We get left with a dead reef which is covered in algae, and we lose all the special animals that live there. And the main reason that we're losing our coral reefs is due to global warming. So we're adding carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases by using fossil fuels, and the atmosphere, the temperature in the atmosphere has gone up, and the ocean has absorbed a lot of that heat, that extra heat in the atmosphere. And it's also been affected, it's warmed. It's only about a 1 degree Celsius change in sea surface temperature, but it's been enough to affect the coral reefs all around the world. So what happens when coral bleaches is, here we can see a healthy coral branch, okay, with the brown color with all the algae inside the polyp, and the coral is stressed, and what happens is the relationship between the coral and the algae, which is a symbiosis, that relationship breaks down, and the coral releases the algae into the water. It needs to temporarily get rid of the algae. So it's still alive, but remember from the earlier slide, the polyps are transparent without the algae. So it loses its color, and we see the bright white skeleton beneath, so hence the term bleaching. And then, so if that stress remains, the coral dies, and bad kind of algae, so the seaweed type algae, which is in competition with the coral, then colonizes that dead skeleton. And we've had what we call mass bleachings, global mass bleachings, where vast areas of coral reefs have been affected. And there's been 3. The first one was in 1998, which affected much of the Indo-Pacific region, and it lasted 1 year. And then it took 10 years for the reefs to recover. So the reefs recover slowly. It's like cutting down a forest. It takes time for everything to grow back to what it was. The next one was in 2010, so there was quite a gap between them, and also lasted for 1 year. But then the next one was in 2014, so only 4 years later we had another bleaching. Again, much of the Indo-Pacific was affected, and this one lasted for 3 years, so it was a 3-year bleaching event. Affected different parts of the world's reefs at different times. The Great Barrier Reef in Australia was bleached in 2016 and 2017 during that period, and unfortunately again in 2020, and then again this year, so it's been very badly affected. Okay, so there's not enough time for the reefs to recover because they're happening so often and they're becoming more frequent, so this is a problem. But other things, other activities that we are creating are also causing further problems, particularly overfishing, so removing the special herbivore fish, things like parrotfish, rabbitfish, and surgeonfish. They're the ones that graze the algae on the reef. They keep the coral healthy. So if we fish those out, and if we add nutrients to the water as well, which is happening due to farming activities or sewage that's going into the ocean, the algae grows more and more. So, and that can smother and kill the coral as well. So all these things, all these activities are reducing the resilience of the reef or its ability to recover. So this is also a problem, and it's causing further coral mortality. So basically coral reefs are in crisis all over the world. So what can we do to try and save them? Well, the biggest thing we need to do is to reduce global warming. So we have to address that. That's one of the primary drivers, and in order for coral reefs to survive into the future, we need to reduce global warming. And if we're looking at the moment, we've got an increase of 1 degree Celsius in the atmosphere, and by 2050 we really want to minimize that to 1.5, and countries around the world are working on that, but maybe not quite fast enough, because it seems like that's going to happen anyway. So we are going to lose more coral reefs. If we look at even more of an increase in temperature projected by 2100 to be 3 degrees Celsius increase, then we could lose most of our reefs around the world. So this has to be addressed, not just for the oceans, but also for terrestrial habitats. We need to cut our reliance on fossil fuels and move to more sustainable energies. So other things we need to do is we need to make more marine protected areas, so to protect the reefs that we already have. So for instance, Komodo National Park, obviously that was set up for protection of the Komodo dragon, but then also the marine environment there is very rich. And here we're quite lucky because we're in a special part of the world where it's called a cool spot. So if you go snorkeling in the national park, the first thing you notice pretty much is the water temperature. It's quite chilly. If you snorkel here, the water temperature is a little bit higher. So that's really helped the coral reefs in the national park, and especially in the Lesser Sunda area, all these islands, we still have very healthy reefs. So we're in a lucky part of the world where the coral reefs are going to persist more into the future. But we need to do other things to manage our reefs better. We need to set up more protected areas to look after our coral reefs. So just to introduce some of the habitats that we have here at the resort. So probably you can't really see the map here, but hey, we're here anyway. So in front of the Naga Pier here, we have our house reef. Okay, so you can see the shallow area of water here. There's a very nice reef here. And also just over here where we've got some guests swimming on the other side of the line there's also a very nice example of a very nice reef. So here we have a high diversity of corals, and they're relatively healthy, but not quite as healthy as in the national park, but they're still very good. And also you might have noticed as you're walking along the jetty, we have our coral nursery, or we have a new area of reef that we've created. And here we can see just some images from the lagoon. So in this area of the lagoon, it's naturally sandy, with some patches of coral, but there's still some interesting things there. And then the next slide we can see some of the creatures that we can find, and the corals a bit further out, so more diversity, so very nice life in this area. And here in front on the house reef is a very nice location for snorkeling. So the idea of the coral nursery was to create a really nice new reef where there was some existing coral before, but we've added to that. So we wanted to create a nice restoration area, and this is one of the things that we can do to step in and help the reef. So where the reefs have suffered around the world, where they've bleached, we've lost coral, we can actually start to restore the coral reef. So this is actually quite a time-consuming thing, but it can be done on even a bigger scale. We call it coral gardening. So what we're doing is we're collecting fragments of coral that we find that have broken off from the healthy colonies of coral which happen. So we collect these fragments, and what we do is we attach them to ropes, and we grow the coral from a fragment about this size in 12 months to a small colony. And we can actually increase the amount of fragments that we find, so we can cut them into pieces and then we put them onto a rope, and for about 8 to 12 months they're growing in a nursery. And so once they've grown to a good size, we can then outplant them. And one of the things that we use a lot is we use these coral frames for outplanting our coral fragments. And these are particularly useful to restore areas of reef that have been damaged, especially through destructive fishing, so like bomb fishing, where the reef has been reduced to rubble, or indeed in other places where we want a stable platform to plant our coral fragments. So this is the outplanting process. We can also attach the coral fragments to the reef itself, so to the rocky areas where the coral is now not there anymore. We can use different techniques for that. But this technique is very simple, works very well. So this is what we're going to plant. So we're going to plant up 2 coral frames. So we've got 75 coral frames in the coral nursery area. So that area is now completely covered with coral. So the project was started when the resort opened by the marine biologist that joined in the beginning, and then I took over in 2020, early 2020, and that's been my job, or one of my jobs has been to get this completely covered with coral. And as you can see today, we've got a very nice view in there. So we've got a mix of hard corals, mostly branching acropora corals. These are the ones that we naturally find here anyway. And here we can see a picture of our coral fragments growing on the ropes. So these are about 6 months old. Yeah, about 6 months growth. So from a finger to, you can see already we have new branches and new growth. And the coral fragments grow quickly on the ropes, so it's kind of a way of speeding up how fast they grow. They're surrounded by nutrients and light, so they grow a bit quicker. And then here, this is probably a bit harder for you to see, but this is 2 months difference in growth on one of our coral frames. So 2 months apart. So on this slide you can see the center area of the frame is now filled in, and you can see branches appearing on colonies. So in 2 months we can have quite a good amount of growth, and now this frame is completely covered in coral, so we can't actually see the frame anymore. So this process, in about 2 years, we can go from an area with little coral cover to 100% if we wanted to. And some of the animals that have moved in to occupy this new habitat, so here we're lucky to have healthy reefs surrounding us as well. So there's a lot of animals that are moving around. They're ready to move into a new area of coral reef that we've created. Yeah, so here we can see some of the different fish species that we've recorded from this area. So Komodo National Park has 1,000 species of coral reef fish, and it kind of reflects the diversity of the surroundings in that we found 100 species of fish from this small area. Okay, so, and they're here for different reasons. So some of these fish we find as juveniles, so it's a nursery area for them because the water